Welcome to Rockhampton with Nyree Johnson, the podcast that celebrates the people, places, and stories that make Rocky and the wider Central Queensland community extraordinary. I firmly believe we're sitting on a golden goose in this region, and I love meeting the people who are doing the quiet work behind the scenes to keep the community thriving. They run our sports clubs, they organise our charities, they support the people who are lost in the system, and they volunteer their time so generously. And I feel like the luckiest person in the world when someone shares their story with me privately. And now I'm privileged to bring their stories and achievements to you, the listeners of Rockhampton with Nyree Johnson. Sometimes they wonder why they were asked, thinking that what they're doing and what they've done is not that big of a deal. And I can hand on heart tell you that it absolutely is. Other times my guests are ecstatic to be asked, and they look forward to sharing a piece of their Rocky and Central Queensland story. Thank you for listening in. I truly appreciate you being here. All right, today's guest is the amazing Cherry, the woman of many talents who does some amazing work in our community and works really, really hard in paid work to support the young people of the Rockhampton region, but also in her downtime has some pretty epic activities that she likes to undertake, which I'll let her tell you more about. But I absolutely love being connected with you, Cherry, and love watching all of the amazing work that you do in the community for young people as well as for the big community, wrestling community fans, and of course our local pin-up women. And that's just tip of the iceberg for what you get yourself involved in. But thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nyree. You know, I'm a huge fan of the podcast. As you've, catchphrased multiple times, I'm a Rocky tragic.
Yes.
I love this region. I love doing the work that I do. And I was so excited to hear what you would have to say. You know, we talked previous to the podcast. I'd be like, well, what do you want me to talk about? I do so many different things.
Yes.
Downtime is a very novel idea. Very interesting choice of words there. But yeah, I love the region. I love doing the work I do, whether it's in a professional or personal capacity. And
yes,
I'm a woman with many hats.
You certainly are. And one thing that I love most about having you as a guest is, like, any bio that I write or write or pre-planned was never going to do it justice. And to be honest, I don't write them anymore. So people who used to watch the very first couple of episodes would have noticed I was reading from a screen because, you know, when you do something new and it's unfamiliar and you don't know what you're doing, so I try and prepare and plan as much as possible. And I was writing people's bios and then I was sounding a little bit robotic, and well, I wasn't really. No one said that, but you know,
We're
for someone
always
like
our toughest critics, aren't we?
yes, for someone like yourself, I'm really looking forward to pulling back the layers of who Cherry is across the episode, because I think you're going to blow quite a few people away with what you do. And yeah, downtime is a bit of a novelty because you, like myself, we don't have much of it. However, what we do involve ourselves in lights us up and lifts us up.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's not all work. It's really impactful stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I've always lived by the motto that I want to make wherever I am in the world, I want to make that little corner of the world a better place for having me in it.
Yes.
And I think, you know, that's something that I realized pretty early on in my teenage years and in high school, you know, as we're kind of navigating that path of where we want to go and what we want to do in life.
Mm.
And I think that was the thing that sat with me the best. And I think it's just taken on a life of its own. I've accidentally become a very, very busy person.
It absolutely has taken on a life of its own, because I won't reveal too much, of course, because this episode is going to be a lot of fun. And I've really, really been looking forward to it. So thank you so much for joining. Before I really get stuck into the good questions, though, I mean, they're all good questions, but tell me, if you could be an expert at anything at all in the world, what would it be and why?
As a fan of the potty, I think this is probably the question I've sat with the absolute most. So you say before we get into the deep dive of things, but as a neurodiverse person, I think that this was the question that was probably the hardest hitting. What do I talk about? Do I talk about, my quirks and my interests? I think the first things that came to mind, I would love to be able to name every single dinosaur that has ever existed on this plane of Earth. I would love to be able to tell you everything there is to know about Pokemon. But I think the thing that landed the most with me is if I could be an expert on anything, I think it would be human history. And most importantly, I think storytelling.
Mm.
For me, as a little kid, I always had such diverse interests.
Yes.
But I think my first love and the thing that's kind of been consistent through my whole life is stories. Whether it was a little picture book my grandmother got me when I was a kid, which was my first Bible, and it had all the best parts, the stories of the Bibles in there, the David versus Goliath. I always had a bit of a personal attachment to all of the Jezebels that were described, in those books. But that book led into learning about Greek mythology or pirates, history, and it was always those stories and the people in those stories that really, set that fire in my belly about hearing all the great things that they did. And not just that, but I think the struggles that people go through. That was always something that landed with me. And I think that's what led to me going away to university and doing a drama degree. My parents always said, what are you actually going to use that for? Do you want to be a movie star? And that never sat with me. I never wanted to be a movie star on the stage or anything like that. I just wanted to learn stories. And I think nothing captures that better than theatre, than drama, Shakespeare,
Absolutely agree.
So storytelling, what makes a good story, the human elements, the part of our neurology and psychology that kind of connect us with those stories, being able to see ourselves in other people. I think that's something I would like to be the expert on.
That's a fantastic one. And stories are, as you know, what connects us as people.
Yeah.
We can share an experience factually, and it's not really going to land, but it's when we convert that into a story that we can actually picture what that experience might have been like for someone.
Yeah.
And it's evident as well in, the movies that are on streaming services and, books that were non-fiction books or real events that have been turned into movies or short series. It helps make it's an opportunity to connect a little bit better with those stories. So
yeah, and it's why I've always been a huge advocate in the arts space. I think that's what makes us uniquely human. That's what separates us from, the other creatures and the other races that are on this plane, is our ability to connect with personal histories, with facts, but connect those with our feelings. And I'm definitely somebody that connects with my feelings and the potential feelings of other people rather than those facts. And I think that's why I've ended up in the work that I do.
Yes, yes. And even thinking about that, which of course the audience doesn't yet know what it is that you're doing, but when I think about the work that you do with Headspace, in particular with young people, from not only from a paid employment perspective, but also in your volunteer work, I can't think of anyone better. Like, there are a lot of amazing people out there working in this space, but it's like, when you see someone and they're going to apply for a job. I've had this happen to another friend of mine, and the position description, essentially, the title of the position.
Yeah.
And it's almost like I've said to my friend, and this is the case for you as well, it's almost like if you looked up that job title in the thesaurus, you would see Cherry.
I mean, if we go right down to it, I think that's why I ended up in the position that I am. I went away to uni. I did my arts degree in drama, and at the time I just tacked on a graduate diploma in education. I thought teaching and being around young people and getting to share stories and educate and learn, that was always where my passion was. And it just kind of made sense that that's where I ended up. But for 10 years, I really struggled with the constraints of the education department. and
Mm.
curriculum constantly changing and government being able to decide what was and wasn't valuable to teach young people. I was
Mm.
very fortunate. I fell in love with the schools that I taught at and the young people I worked with and my colleagues, and I couldn't have had a more supportive environment. But it
Mm.
just didn't quite land with me as my sole purpose
Absolutely.
that I thought I would be able to do forever. I just couldn't. And so
Mm.
when this position came up in community engagement and education with young
Mm.
people, I looked at the position description and I had no interest in leaving
Mm.
education at the point. I thought I
Mm.
was just going to soldier on and continue to inspire the next generation. But when I found this position description, that's when I was like, oh my goodness, I can get paid to do this.
Yes, it was written exactly for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the journey that led you. Of course, we've got the last little bit of your career as a teacher leading into this role, but what is it across your life, those key moments, key people, key experiences that have really shaped who you are and how you show up in the world?
Yeah, again, fan of the podcast, knew the question was coming, and I think this is something that I sat with for a long time. Because for me, I think that we're all kind of that amalgamation of the people we know.
Mm.
I think there's little parts of me, you know, in everyone I've ever met, and vice versa. Everybody I've ever met, I always take away a little part of them, and that kind of makes up who I am today.
Mm.
But when I really thought about the people that influenced me, somebody who I was really surprised but made the most sense was my paternal grandmother.
Mhm.
So I'll give a shout out to Wendy. I did tell her, I called her when I kind of had this moment. I called her and I said, just so you know, I'm going to talk on a podcast next week. I'm going to talk a bit about you. But I
Yeah.
thought I would
Lovely.
let her know first because my grandmother is such an exceptionally generous and empathetic and compassionate person. Something that sparks her fire was religion.
Mm.
She's a volunteer at her church
Mm.
and has been most of her life, but especially now in retirement. That's her drive, her purpose is helping people through that avenue. And, you know, even though I think in my younger years and especially my teen years, I was quite rebellious against the idea of organized religion, there was so much I didn't agree with and, you know, I didn't want a part of it. I think the real ethics and the crux of Christianity and more specifically her interpretation of those texts, I think that's what's inspired me to be where I am today.
Mm.
Taking care of the community,
Mhm.
you know, taking the privilege that we get in our position sometimes to be able to share and help people that aren't so privileged.
Mm.
And I think that's what's kind of got me here in general. But going back to, I guess, the catalyst that had me leave education and expand whatever my professional, you know, experience was, the thing that was most impactful was having kids.
Mm.
I remember my first year of teaching. Whenever I would talk to people, whether it was, you know, down the pub or at somebody's birthday party, whenever I would meet new people, I would talk about my kids. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, and one of my kids is doing this and one of my kids was doing that. And they'd be like, wow, you look so young to be having kids. And I was like, oh, no, I'm not talking about my biological children. I'm
Yes.
talking about the young people who I teach. Those are my kids.
Yes.
And then when I met my husband and, you know, he had a child to a previous marriage, my oldest daughter, Sky, you know, when we started doing that kind of that phase of our life and I had our youngest daughter, Sailor, they're both 9 and 3 now. It was having that family and having those children that relied on me. I think that
Mm.
really changed my relationship with education.
Mhm.
You know, I couldn't be the teacher that I was before. I didn't
Mm.
have those school holidays. I didn't have after school to be doing all of that additional work that is in one part required to do the job well, but also because I
Yeah.
was so passionate about it, I wanted to do that work. That's what lit the fire in my belly. And after
Mm.
having my kids, I just didn't have the capacity to be
Mm.
the teacher that I once was, to be the teacher that I wanted to be, and most importantly, to be the teacher that my other kids, the kids at school, deserved.
Yes.
And that's when I started going back to work after having my second child. That was really the catalyst that made me rethink how much longer can I do this? How can I be a
Mm.
good teacher and a good mum?
Mm.
You know, I mean, I haven't talked publicly before about it, but I'm an open book. And I had a really tough time with postpartum depression.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I want to say it wasn't a surprise, but, you know, being somebody who cares as deeply as I do, it was really hard to try and realign my priorities. During that time, you know, a lot of mothers experience losing part of themselves, losing their identity when, you know, your heart and your hormones just want to give everything to your kids. There's very little room for yourself. And I'm very, very lucky to have the beautiful husband that I do. One of the first guests on this podcast, Colt Winchester at Medlin, Cowman, Winnie, whatever name you know him by.
Yes.
And, you know, despite him constantly encouraging me to take time for myself, to, you know, go back to the things that lit my fire, internally, I just really struggled with being able to do that because I wanted to be there for my kids. I wanted to be there for my family. I wanted to do all the things I was doing and I wanted to do it well, but I just had very little capacity to be the best at all the things I wanted to be the best at.
A lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, like a lot of people, particularly new mums, you put a lot of pressure on yourself to be a certain way. And it is such a shift in the way you see the world when you have children of your own.
Yeah. It's something that I think we do talk a lot about as a society in the modern era. But it's something, you know, as much as I was aware, it's something that you truly cannot understand until you've gone through that yourself. And I think that was really hard. I think a lot of us tie our identity with what we do for work, what we do for money.
Absolutely, we do. Yes.
And for 10 years, I was a teacher. I was a drama teacher, an arts teacher. And though I was able to have that avenue for creativity and inspiration, I wasn't able to do it as I could do it before. And I was very hard on myself about not being the teacher that I was. But I think the beautiful thing about having my kids is that my girls have taught me that I'm so much more than that. To them, I'm not Miss Rawlings. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a drama teacher. They barely knew that person.
Yes.
And through their eyes, I was really able to discover and explore who I am as a person, not who I am in relation to other people. I'm not just their mom. I'm not just a wife. I'm not just a teacher. I'm so much more than that. And so having my girls, that was the big catalyst, I think.
That is such a beautiful way to describe that transition period that you go through when you were yourself and you had your identity or what you thought you like could be classified as your identity, to then move into looking at yourself through the eyes of your children and figuring it out. Who exactly are you and how you show up in the world? And as I mentioned briefly in my introduction, you show up in the world in a massive way. Like you're empowering other people, you're empowering women, the pockets of the community who sometimes are either forgotten or some people may wish didn't exist. I don't mean to be harsh or upsetting, but sometimes that is, you know, we find these people, but it's people like yourself who shines a light on those people who make this world go around. And I love that you're not defined by one role or one name even.
Nothing close to Wyatt, but there are a couple of...
Yes, and I just love that you show up how you want to in whatever format is on the cards at the time.
And I think that was the big thing. I think you've nailed it there, is I show up how I want to. I think coming into this position in community engagement, it really taught me to say no, because there are so many opportunities in this region. There are so many expos and schools and nonprofits and organizations. There's so many young people that I have the potential to work with. But it's about being able to identify where the most impact could be made, how that work aligns with my own values as a person. This role is very much what you make of it. And so one of the hardest lessons was learning to say no, was
Yes.
knowing that, yes, there are some possibilities that I'm going to let people down. But if I can't show up as my fullest self, if I can't show up and have the most impact at that time, whether it's because, you know, our engagement plan doesn't align with it or my own personal capacity, it's being able to show up in the ways that I can. And I think that's the most important thing about all the things that I do, is that I do a lot, but I do it because I want to.
Yes, I can absolutely relate to that. Absolutely relate. And I would imagine a lot of people who catch up with you or are connected with you, you know, the activities that you do, the things that you get involved in, the people that you lift up and empower, it all looks like a lot. But as I said at the start, it's not a lot for you because it's work that lifts you up. It lights you up and it doesn't even feel like work.
No. I maintain I have the best job in the world. Because I get to be creative. And I think, you know, that's one of my core priorities. That's one of my core values, and just one of the things I think, you know, makes life exciting is creativity and innovation. But I also get to help people. And I think, what a better life could I ask for than to be able to balance all of these plates and have fun doing it?
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about, you know, you've got multiple hats, well, different names, you know, from standing on stage to, you know, hosting our local CQ pinups to hosting the wrestling Allegiance. I hope I'm saying that right.
Wrestling Allegiance, Rockhampton.
Being your number one fan of Cowman, Wyatt, your amazing husband, who my dad actually dubbed him. I'm sure you've been told this, but my dad dubbed him as the Steve Irwin of mental health.
My goodness, hasn't that catchphrase just caught on? Anytime I tell people, I think it's the greatest thing ever, that every time I tell people, they go, yes, that's exactly, that's the drive, the passion that he has.
Well, I love it. And like talking to him is so, and of course to you as well, it's just so uplifting, and, you know, to hear his challenges over time. But when my dad, it's funny, and he'll hear this because he listens to all of these episodes. He's my biggest podcast fan. Let's just say he's my biggest fan in general, I hope anyway. You know, I love that. I love that he enjoys these podcasts, and sometimes I think, well, if I just do a good podcast for Dad, then that's enough. But when for anyone who's listening, Alan Wooler is the person who has dubbed Wyatt Medlin as Steve Irwin of mental health. And if you have not heard Wyatt's podcast, please go and listen to it, because you will instantly understand why he has got that title, and that Alan Wooler did give him that title. One day they might meet.
I listened to the podcast in preparation for today. That's what was playing in the car on the drive here, because, you know, I think, I won't say he's an unsung hero, because he certainly gets a lot of praise for the work that he does. But I think the thing I'm most grateful for with my husband is that he is incredibly motivational. You know, just being in a space with him when he's talking about the things that he loves and he's passionate about, I think that's really what invigorated me and reinvigorated me after having the girls to be the person that I am today. He's an incredible influence on everybody that's around him.
Absolutely agree.
So credit to winning.
Yes, credit.
Which I think brings us back to your original question about the journey here.
Yeah, the journey to, like, you're up on stage one minute, you're leading a wrestling show the next, you're in character yourself, you're there for your kids, your girls. Like what does that all look like?
I think, like, you know, from an outside perspective, it sounds like a lot of really random things to try and connect in some sort of fluent story. But I think the irony of it is that it all connects quite naturally. So I think it goes back to high school. As somebody who was neurodivergent and didn't quite realize it at the time, a lot of young women, especially at that time, were going undiagnosed as being autistic or being on the autism spectrum. And I think, now as a 30-something-year-old, I think we look back at knowing what we know now. All of those signs were quite evident.
Yes.
I was in a gifted and talented program in school, just so interested and intrigued by the world. Drama and theatre and stage and performance was all something that came quite naturally to me, which it does a lot of autistic young girls. The idea of masking, the importance of that kind of vocabulary. We talk about it a lot now, but not so much back in the 90s. So being other people and playing other people was a really great way for me to connect with myself and to understand myself. As a teenager, I was somebody who really struggled with the idea of femininity. I had this really rough as guts dad who, was a boilermaker and, in the army in his youth, and he was this really tough guy, and I really looked up to that idea of him. So I struggled with femininity in school. I was the kind of girl who never wore pink, didn't wear skirts, didn't wear makeup. My dad and I would go out and ride the quad bike in the mud flats, and I would come home just covered in muck. And, that was something that is really a core of my childhood. But as I moved away and I went to uni, I really started to discover myself and my femininity, and that I could be somebody who likes professional wrestling, for example, as well as dressing up. And that's where I found rockabilly. That's where I found the pinup culture in Brisbane. I remember going to my first ever Grease Fest, which is, 1950s vintage inspired alternative festival down in Brisbane. And I felt like I'd finally found my people. The fashion is something that's truly unique, I think, to the modern era. It really marries alternative culture, the leopard print and studs and big, bold black eyeliner with those feminine silhouettes and shapes of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And that really resonated with me. And I remember seeing my first rockabilly competition and thinking, one day I'm going to be up on that stage.
Yes.
And I did. I had a crack at the pageants myself. Most of my, 20s, I was the one on the stage competing and playing this character. But in doing that, I think, fell in love with the model and the shape of rockabilly culture and those kinds of things. And, when I moved up to Rockhampton for teaching, I got a job at a high school here. I thought, you know what, I'd like to have a crack at making this kind of thing happen up here. There's a huge car culture in Rocky. Rocky Nats, obviously, being the shining star of that in most recent years. And so I thought, I want to bring that to Rocky. I want to make other women feel how 19-year-old me felt that first time walking into Grease Fest, which is how the Rockabilly Nats kind of came to fruition.
Yes.
And the next part of that is, in that time in Brisbane, another thing I've always been passionate about is professional wrestling. I think growing up and seeing those women, be beautiful. And they are some of the most beautiful women you've ever seen in your life. Seeing the pageantry of, the rhinestones and the leather and the makeup and the hair, but also seeing these women be incredibly strong. I think my first real hero was China, and she was this bodybuilder. She was a fitness model prior to her professional wrestling career, and she just had these huge muscles. And she looked like somebody you didn't want to meet in a dark alley. But she was beautiful and feminine and strong. And seeing those stories play out on my TV, it's very much like a telenovela or, a soap opera. Instead of watching Home and Away, I was watching SmackDown on a Friday afternoon.
Love it.
And hearing those stories that are innately human, the good versus evil, the strong and the weak, the big and the small. There's stuff that the reason why professional wrestling, I think, has become such a special corner of pop culture is because it explores those stories of humanity in a really exaggerated, volatile spectacle. And that really spoke to me. So when I was down in uni, whole new world in Brisbane, small town gal in the big city, I remember seeing a poster for my first wrestling show. Oh my God, there's wrestling in Australia? And so I went along to the show. I met one of my best friends, my good mentor, Australian Wolf, at that show. And I said, how do I do this? How do I get into pro wrestling? And he was super supportive, but I think cost for training, for gear, was a huge barrier for me in uni. So unfortunately, I didn't get to explore that down there. But leap forward 10 or so years, I moved to Rocky for my teaching job, and I see a poster for Capricorn. And wouldn't you know, front and center, the star of the poster is Australian Wolf in his Wolverine-inspired mask. He's green and gold. And so I flicked him a message. I said, my goodness, what are you doing in Rocky of all places? And he said, well, they've got a pop culture show and we offered to bring the team down to wrestle. You know, you should come along and watch. And funnily enough, from that point, they were looking at starting up an expansion here in Rocky. And of course, I went along to that first training session, you know, finally getting to live out those childhood dreams. And that's where I met my husband.
Oh, fantastic.
And the rest is history, you know. From all of the things that I loved as a kid, all of a sudden, all of those things were a possibility here in Rocky of all places. So that's how I kind of got to where I am now. I, you know, started my career in wrestling being a pro wrestler. I was the only female in the region, one of the only women in the state that was doing it. And there's various expansions, you know, in these companies of wrestling. Here in Rocky, we have Wrestling Allegiance Rockhampton. Up in Townsville, they have the Queensland Wrestling Alliance. And there's a number of really incredible groups down in Brisbane. And somehow in 2019 and 2020, I was one of the only women that was doing it in the state at the time.
Yeah, wow.
So what that meant is Rocky had to get okay with, you know, intergender wrestling. There weren't other women for me to wrestle. And still to this day in my entire career, there is only one woman who I have had a singles match with in about 4 or 5 years of wrestling.
Wow.
Now I'm super proud to say that there are a lot more women out there giving it a crack and having it a go, doing an incredible job at it. And I love to see it. I love to see, you know, other women getting to live out my childhood dream. You know, they get to be that China, that strong, beautiful force. But yeah, so
I love that. I absolutely love that.
Taking a mind of its own. Nowadays, I'm ring announcing for the wrestling. It was a long journey returning to pro wrestling after having my daughter, a lot of health complications, a lot of insecurities, I think, for myself as well. Like, could I pick up where I left off? Could I be what I once was? But I think it's kind of been a blessing in disguise because I think I love ring announcing more than I ever loved being in the ring.
Yeah, wow. Well, you do it so well as well. And I guess that's why you're such a great rockabilly host as well as a ring announcer. And it's that vibrancy and passion that you bring to those events that bring more and more people in. And, you know, you've got your competitors, of course, but to get the crowds as well, that's the important bit, and you definitely get the crowds.
That's my favorite bit. I think that was the thing that I fell in love with most, because as a pro wrestler, you know, I think a lot of people have this perception of pro wrestling that it's much like dance, that it's choreographed and everything is rehearsed, but it really couldn't be further from the truth. I think there's core psychology and structure and moves that come into it, but a lot of it is happening on the fly. If you are not good at improvisation, you are not going to be a good pro wrestler. So, you know, when the gals are out there and they're running those matches in front of the crowd, there's very minimal opportunity to be there in the moment, to be able to, I guess, see the fans, see the crowds, engage with people and make those connections. So for me, ring announcing, emceeing the rockabilly competitions, the greatest joy is getting to stand up on that stage and watch the people that are observing the audience and their reactions. I think there is nothing more visceral and human than seeing a little kid in the front row reacting to a massive wrestling move. You know, seeing that kid in the front row with the classic like scream face, like, oh my goodness, did that just happen?
Yes.
Being able to observe that and witness that as a host, that's what makes my heart sing. That's what it's all about. It's all about the people that are enjoying and entertained by this.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And of course, it's all volunteer work as well. Of course, what you're doing in your day job with young people is your paid work. But when you're with wrestling and, you know, these organizations and groups don't run themselves. So, you know, they require meetings and insurances and planning and organizing and booking venues and, you know, and that's all volunteer work. And you're bringing that to a pocket of the community with a team, of course, for both the pro wrestling as well as the Rockabillys and giving them that opportunity. And, you know, Rockabilly is so well done here in Rocky that people travel for it. And I know people do travel Rocky Nats, they do in general, but you know, there are entrants who are not entering their cars at Rocky Nats, but they're here for Rockabilly. And that in itself speaks to what has been created and the team that you and your team have pulled together.
Absolutely. When I first kind of came up with the idea of and started working towards doing pinup shows. Obviously, there are some that existed in the region previous. So my perspective, my hope was to not only engage those women that are already active in that scene, but help expand that to other women in the region. I never in my wildest dreams could have thought that there'd be women traveling from Mackay, Townsville, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast. We've even had a couple of women applying from out of state just because they want to be a part of this competition. They want to see what Rocky Nats is all about. And just want to be a part of what we're doing here in Rocky. It's incredible.
And we do some epic stuff. Like I did move away for a short period. I grew up in Rocky, moved away for a short period, but came back. And, you know, when you're a young person, well, this was my experience. When you're a young person, you don't appreciate what you've actually got. And then you move away and then you come back and you go, oh my goodness, we are sitting on a gold mine here. Literally, if we go to Mount Morgan, but you know, we've got so much to offer. And while it might not be as big and as huge as what might be available in the capital cities, we've still got it. And, you know, you and I have spoken at length and even Wyatt as well. You know, we are Rocky Tragics. We are. But tell me what does being a Rocky Tragic actually mean to you and that community contribution that not only what Rocky delivers to you, but what you deliver to Rocky?
I think, and I'm going to borrow from my husband on this one, I think a big part is being who I needed, you know, and you've touched on it perfectly there when you said as teenagers, as adolescents, developmentally, we're not supposed to want to be where we are. You know, that's part of our hormonal drive is to separate from the tribe and to find something else, you know. That's
I love that you know that too, because
I'm such a nerd for neuroscience and evolution. I want to know why I feel the way I do. So I think one of the beautiful things that I do in my work is I get to learn those things. So developmentally, for the sustainability of your tribe, of your group, you need to have genetic diversity. So part of that is whilst we're going through puberty is there are these hormones that create this wanderlust that we have to escape from where we are. We have to go, we have to travel, we have to be somewhere else so that we can help spread that seed and contribute to genetic diversity. So, I mean, if any young people listen to this podcast, it's something I say every day in my work is it's actually really normal to feel that way. You're supposed to feel that way. I myself as a teenager could never imagine that once I'd moved away to the big city that I would ever come back to regional Queensland. Let alone to come back and love it. So a big part of that for me was being who I needed, and being able to see diversity in my region, being able to see that there are people just like me here, and to create cool opportunities for the young people in our region to do things that they didn't think was possible here. And I think, again, that's what I love about Rockhampton is because if we moved away and tried to create, whether it's the Rockabilly Nats competitions or our own professional wrestling organization or even Cowmen Gaming Co., if we were trying to do that in somewhere like Brisbane, we would discover a lot of barriers that would stop us from doing that because there is so much diversity in those areas. But I think here, what makes Rocky an amazing place to be able to do all these cool things is that we have such resounding support from other people in our community, whether it's professional capacities like the council or Advanced Rockhampton. But more important than that, it's the other people, it's just the everyday man. It's people like yourself who see cool things starting to bubble under the surface and they go, I want to be a part of that.
Yes.
And if it wasn't for businesses funding the things that we do, venues giving us spaces, and the bustling events calendar that we have here in Rocky, we wouldn't be able to do any of those things. So it's a really reciprocal relationship between, the things that we do and the community that we're planted. Both of those are the reasons why we can do what we do.
Absolutely. And sometimes when I visit the capital city, it's almost like I put myself, if I plugged and played the Rocky that I know, the Rocky that I've created for my family in Brisbane, it doesn't even translate.
Yeah.
You just can't replicate it. And I think that's one of the things that when you figure that out and you really truly know what you're sitting on, it makes it so much more magical to be here and then to have that extra connection with the community and be personally invested in the success of not only people, but the community groups, the not-for-profits, the organisations that support this community and the businesses that are in this community and, getting behind governments and decisions and advocating and having, influence where possible as well. And that's available here. I feel like it's more readily available here. Our local team, whether any layer of government in any party, has always been receptive to what our community needs. And, they want to come on this journey as well. So whereas I'm just not sure that would be as available in a much bigger city where there's different priorities.
Absolutely. Like, I have been blown away. In what universe does somebody like me get to have meetings with our local mayor, our MPs, and not only just meeting them and telling stories and advocating for change, but being able to witness that feedback being implemented in our local community?
Yes.
Incredible.
Yes.
As you said, regardless of parties and positions, the people that are working in our community are here because they care and they want to make it a better place for everybody here. And being able to see that play out in real time, that's been just a gift, an absolute gift. I'm so grateful for where we are. As Rocky Tragics, I am so grateful.
We are. We'll just own it. We'll just be Rocky Tragics. Maybe I should just rename the podcast.
Rocky Tragics. Like, for me, I think like teenage me and all of the young people that I work with are going to roll their eyes at this, but I love living in the beef capital. I love driving down the street and being able to count how many fiberglass cow statues you can find, or should I say bull statues? Most of them are bulls. Again, something I never would have learnt if I didn't live in Rockhampton.
Do you know there's a tour? There is a tour to do around Rocky regarding bull statues.
Is this a part of like the Explore Rockhampton? I feel like your podcasts always end up being promotional, like Explore Rockhampton.
I don't work for the council. Let's just make that clear. I'm not being paid to promote this. No, I did it one year. It was really funny. I did this tourist at home thing and
I listened to a podcast.
All those tours.
That's what me and the kids did these holidays. We took a holiday in Rockhampton. When I was younger, I went on a cruise that stopped in at Gladstone, and I was like, well, I live here, What is there to see in Gladstone? And I was astounded by how many things they were advertising and promoting. And from that point, I decided I'm going to holiday where I live a little bit more often.
Yes.
And so, yeah, consider me inspired. I love those. I love that idea.
Yeah. Yeah, they are so good. So tell me, we have got so many amazing things that happen in our lives. We also have some devastatingly horrible things that happen in our lives and challenges, of course, well, which you've already talked to a little bit with your experience after having children. But has there been a standout moment at either end of the scale, whether it's a positive or a challenge, that's really shifted your path? Like it's changed the direction that you're on. Your perspective is changed because of the moment.
Yeah, I think it's more lots of little moments rather than one large one. You know, the huge catalyst being a parent. I think the theme of my life has definitely been mental health. And feeling like I couldn't talk about it, and I couldn't let people know that I was struggling. You know, I've always been quite a large personality, somebody who helps people. And I think, you know, when I was in those positions, whether it's, you know, in a friend group or in work, I've often felt like I couldn't admit when I was struggling, when I was going through hard times and when things were too much. And I think, you know, the word strong, you know, you'd often, you know, whenever you try to talk about and share mental health concerns and when you're struggling, I think the hardest thing to hear from people is, what? But you're so strong. And, you know, I grew up most of my life being really afraid of that. You know, it's very demoralizing when you're trying to be vulnerable with somebody, when you're trying to share your struggles and get something off your chest, when, you know, it's almost like people didn't believe me when I said that I was having a tough time. And, you know, I think that resurfaces a lot throughout my life. I think I'm very fortunate to be where I am, and I'm very grateful for my journey. But there are those times where everything just seems really, really hard. And it wasn't until, you know, I think the first time was when I was starting in uni and I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, that I felt like somebody saw me and understood, you know. And that brings me to being in my 30s now and having an ASD diagnosis. All of those things made me feel like I wasn't as alone as I thought I was in the world.
Yeah.
And that there might have been, you know, some reasons, some validations to those feelings. And I think by acknowledging them, it's not saying that you are weak or that you are broken. For me, those were always the catalyst to be able to move forward.
Yes.
Knowing
It's like,
knowing that,
yeah, knowing stuff.
yeah, as a big old nerd, it gave me something to do research on, to understand and to learn about, you know, when was ASD first starting to be diagnosed? Where do they think that those things are coming from? What are the traits and what can we do about it? And I think that has been probably the most empowering part of my life since having my children, you know, whether it was postpartum depression or is exploring the ideas and the research behind neurodiversity. It was being given options of where to go to next. And I think that's why I love the work that I do, because I never would have known those things unless I was here. I've learned more from these young people than they will ever know.
Yes.
About who I am and that it's okay.
And when you have information, like as you said, you can do what you like with it. Essentially, you can either pretend it doesn't exist or, you know, let it make excuses, or you can use that information to empower your next steps, like your next moves, to help you make better sense of the world and, you know, how everything in it works. And it's almost like you can not make excuses for teenage years or whatever, but it makes sense.
Absolutely.
And
that double-edged sword of knowledge. You know, as you said, you can use it as an excuse. Something that I said a lot in teaching that I've carried forward into my everyday life is that it explains it. It doesn't excuse it.
Absolutely.
So it's that double-edged sword of being armed with that knowledge. I could let it weigh me down. I could see it as a burden. I can make excuses and avoid doing things because they are too hard, and this is why. Or I could use that knowledge as my weapon and figure out how to cut a path forward with that. information.
Absolutely. No, it's great insight, and it's just feeds the work that you do as well as benefits you as well, selfishly. Like when I work with younger people, I feel really selfish because I feel like I get more out of the situation and the environment and the lessons than what they do. But here's hoping we're adding value in whatever we do.
And,
And I think it's so important that you said about all of those little moments because we do have big moments in our lives. And of course, I'm always calling them out in this podcast, but sometimes the biggest moments are an accumulation of all of those little ones. And whether it be a positive outcome or a negative, it's something that we can learn from, and it helps to shape and shift our perspective moving forward.
That's why I love you, Nyree. You always say exactly what I'm thinking.
Oh, I love it. Well, there we go. I'm doing a good service then. So, you are very energetic, of course. We've spoken about your volunteer work, your paid work, your family, your husband, your different hats that you like to wear, different aliases that you have. What is that thing that keeps driving you forward? Now, of course, when you do sometimes have a challenge with mental ill health, it can be debilitating and but what's that thing that keeps you getting up every day, moving forward, making a difference, wanting to contribute to this world?
I think it's a phrase or a vocabulary we hear thrown around a lot in the mental health space, but the thing that gets me up in the mornings is just gratitude. I
So
constantly
powerful.
find myself, whether it's when I first wake up in the morning, when I go to bed, or even just in a moment when I'm doing the work that I do, is just being so grateful that I get to experience the things that I do. The big moments like standing center stage with the spotlight on you, seeing all the adoring crowd, applauding for you, or whether it's just being able to spend a day in my tracky dacks, watching movies with the kids. It's taking the pressure off of myself to have to be something or do something that other people think is the right thing, and just being grateful that I have the space and the capacity to enjoy the things that I'm doing. If it wasn't fun, I wouldn't do it.
Yes.
And I think that can be a really toxic mentality. It has served me pretty good over the last decade or so, is that I just enjoy it. I get to do what makes my heart sing, what lights that fire in my belly. And it just makes me feel good. So in a selfish way, it's all about me and it's all about feeling good. And I only do things that make me feel good.
No, I love it. And that's a good way to protect your own health and well-being as well. When you do things that align with who you are as a person and the values that you have, it's not easy. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but it's easier to say yes or no to what you get involved with.
And I think that was the hardest part of my journey, is knowing what makes my heart sing, knowing what my values were, knowing who I was is the hardest struggle that I've had to work my way through in my life. But once you get there, you find that nirvana moment of, actually, when I look around, I am all of the parts of what I do, and that's who I am.
Yes.
And
you're not defined by one role or one name. But yes, it's that accumulation. So it's a journey and a half to get to that point in life. I've been there, I feel it, and I guess the big thing that I like to remember or remind young people about is that none of us have got this figured out. Some of us look like we do, but we don't. No one has it all figured out. The person who is 99 years old and maybe in palliative care at a hospital has still not got it figured out. But if you could impart a bit of wisdom onto the generation coming along after us, whether they listen to it or not, we both work with young people. But what would that be? What advice would you give to someone coming along after us regarding anything at all in the world?
I think it's exactly that. I think that it's the realization that our lives and our stories aren't just the good parts. that the journey to who you are, the journey to joy and happiness and stability comes on a really rocky road. Nobody who has ever handed anything an easy life on a silver platter will have interesting stories to share. I think the most interesting people in the history of the world are the people that have gone through hard times and come out the other side and made something of it. I wouldn't be the person that I am today, and neither would anybody I know if it wasn't for those hard times. If it wasn't for the lessons that we learnt along those roads, and if it wasn't for the patience that we have for ourselves to figure it out. I think, I've mentored a lot of young people through my life, through my various jobs and my hobbies. And something that I often say to them when they're going through hard times is, how lucky are you? How lucky are you that you are getting this character defining moment where, might not feel like now, but in 5-10 years time, you get to look back on this moment and go, because of that, I could do this. Because of that, I learned. Because of that, this opportunity came about and I was able to take that, and that's led me onto this path that I am now.
Absolutely agree. You have nailed it.
And to not be in a rush to label anything, I think, as well. I know I've thrown a lot of labels around in this, but if there's one thing that I wish I could convey to the next generation, to other people, is that you don't have to stay in one place. And just because you identify one way now doesn't mean that you'll necessarily identify that way soon. And don't feel like you have to lock yourself into that. I thought I was going to be Stephanie Rawlings, the teacher and mother for the rest of my life. But now I get all of these cool, crazy names and accolades and stories that I get to tell for the rest of my life because I never locked myself into any one thing to define who I was.
Yes, I absolutely love that. You have just summarized every bit of advice possible for young people. It is such it's a lot for them, particularly as teenagers, and, as school doesn't suit everyone, didn't suit me, but it doesn't, you don't have to just finish school, pick a career, stick to that, have 3 kids and a dog and a white picket fence. That doesn't have to be your life if that's not what you want.
And I think, to really circle back right to the beginning, a nice thread, a nice theme is that's the importance of storytelling. That is the importance of this podcast. It's the importance of books and movies and artworks and songs, is that when we can share these stories, we kind of break down that community perception of what the right life is, what adulthood looks like, because we get to learn that there are so many different people and experiences and possibilities in this world that can be unlocked through that storytelling. Listen to other people's stories, learn or leave. You're not going to identify with everything. But by hearing such a broad array and variety of stories, you get to find the bits that resonate with you. And I think that's the beautiful thing of what it means to be a human being.
Yes, absolutely agree. It has been an absolute pleasure having you on this podcast, and I'm so glad that we finally got to record it and catch up. And
2 busy mums as we are.
I think you've provided so much wisdom, advice, guidance, and your story. And I think the listeners are going to really appreciate how much you've shared. And I know I certainly have. And thank you so, so much for your time.
I'm so grateful for you, Nyree. Thanks for having me on. And wisdom is not one I hear often, so I might add that to one of my labels, that I am Cherry the Wise. I'm wise.
Yes, you should add that. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nyree.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Rockhampton with Nyree Johnson, proudly brought to you by Marketing Unagency Co., the marketing team who do things very differently and who are determined to make the world of marketing less chaotic and far clearer for small businesses and community groups.